This week on the podcast, New South Wales Police try to block the Rising Tide People's Blockade, and we talk to Alex Bainbridge about the Queensland state election.
What do we want? The right to protest! When do we want it? Now! What do we want? The right to protest! When do we want it? Now! I say rising, you say tide! Rising tide! Rising tide! Rising tide! Rising tide!
Welcome back to the latest episode of the Green Left News podcast. My name is Isaac Nellist, and I'm talking to you from Gadigal country in Sydney.
I'm Riley Breen, and I'm joining you from the land of the Whadjuk Noongar in Bulu, Perth.
And later on the podcast, we're going to be talking to Alex Bainbridge, who's a Green Left journalist based in Magangin, Brisbane, about the Queensland elections. But before that, we're going to talk about this challenge from the New South Wales Police, who are trying to block the Rising Tide People's Blockade of the world's largest coal port from going ahead. They've initiated a Supreme Court challenge. Before we get started, I just wanted to acknowledge that we are recording this podcast on stolen land that was never ceded and always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Green Left pledges to stand with First Nations people in campaigns for justice, sovereignty, and land rights. And also, before we get started, if you like this podcast, please consider becoming a supporter. Only $5 a month at greenleft.org.au/support, and it makes a massive difference to help us continue. So on with this first story with Rising Tide. So the first day of the Supreme Court case was today, as we're recording, and New South Wales Police are trying to challenge the Form 1, which is the kind of notice of intention to hold a public assembly that protest organisers have to submit before they hold a rally to get the kind of legal protections from some of the minor disruption charges and things like that. So it's one of these little systems that the police can use to try and hold up protest organising.
So is this the same? Is this the same way that the police tried to stop that rally, that Palestine anniversary rally back in October?
Yeah. So about a month ago, the start of October, the New South Wales Police challenged Palestine Action Group to try and block them from organising, the rally that was kind of marking the 1 year or the 12 months of genocide. So that was one that we were successful in beating. They were trying to block the October 6 kind of major rally in the city, which ended up being a massive rally, and obviously the police action didn't deter people. If anything, it kind of gave a big promo and encouraged more people to come. And they were also trying to block a vigil that was organised on the actual October 7 date outside Sydney Town Hall, which was, not a rally. It was just, a vigil mourning the loss of life and things like that. And so both of those challenges were defeated by the Palestine Action Group. And actually today, outside the Supreme Court this morning, there's a press conference where, representatives from Rising Tide and the New South Wales Council of Civil Liberties spoke to the media, and also a representative from Palestine Action Group was there to show their support and solidarity. So it's important to connect. This is all part of a bigger attack on the right to protest that's happening across the country, but this is particularly how it's happening in New South Wales. So for people who weren't following the People's Blockade last year, where they blockaded the coal port for 32 hours. What happened last year, they did have, the Form 1 permissions, everything like that was all go ahead. And the blockade happened for the 30 hours. It was just the last, hour or two where the kind of permission time ran out. And over 100 activists and community members said, why should we have to stop our blockade now? Let's continue. And they pushed past the kind of police deadline, and that was the 100 or so people who got arrested last year, including a 97-year-old, including teenagers, a whole broad spectrum of society who took part in that action. So I think the police are probably anticipating something like that, but they're also it's part of this wider crackdown as well.
Yeah, and I said this a few episodes ago when we were talking about that Palestine Action Group suppression, but the fact that, the government is so desperate to try and clamp down on these protests actually goes to show how effective and how worried they are about them. If they weren't effective, then they wouldn't care.
Yeah, definitely. And Chris Minns, who's the New South Wales Premier, has been quoted quite a few times saying how he doesn't like these protests. He told the Newcastle Herald a few months ago that he doesn't support the Rising Tide blockade and that he'd rather it didn't happen.
Oh,
and he'd also, yeah. Unfortunately, it's not for Chris Minns to decide what protests happen. He's not the ruler of the world, even though he's Premier. The other thing is he's been pushing this idea that protests are expensive for police. He was particularly referencing the Palestine weekly rallies, saying, millions of dollars spent on policing these rallies. But as I think we've made this point many times before on the podcast, but like the activists don't want the police there.
We don't want them there.
Yeah, so that would be an easy way. Another thing that Rising Tide spokesperson Zach Schofield pointed out this morning was if the Minns government is really worried about costs that like they're trying to save some pennies here and there, they could stop the massive amount of money that goes towards fossil fuel subsidies that continue the coal and gas industries. I think it's $14 billion was last year. And obviously that's not all coming from New South Wales government, but, the Labor in power federally and all the different states and are involved. And that would be, a way of actually, thinking of what are the protesters protesting about and what can we do to actually address their concerns rather than just stomping down and trying to block our democratic rights. But, that's probably asking a bit too much from Labor.
I honestly think that they do it as, there's the old saying, you don't negotiate with terrorists or whatever. I honestly think that that's how they view it. Like, if we concede to any of these demands, they're only going to ask for more and more. And to an extent, that's true. We are, we're not going to stop. So I suppose it's not really unrealistic for them to think that way. But I guess they don't want to give in to any of the demands because, they do know that the demands won't stop. If we stop this coal port, then the next step is to say, well, why do we have all these other subsidies? Why do we have all these other gas projects, coal projects, etc.? That is our job as socialists and as activists to push things continuously.
Yeah. And I also think it's kind of their preparation for when they've not really done anything seriously to address climate crisis. And a crazy fact that I learned the other day was that 60% of all the proposed coal and gas projects in the world are in Australia. So we're like really pushing this to continue, this fossil fuel driven crisis. But I think because they're anticipating, the climate crisis is going to get worse. It's going to be more extreme weather, all the flow-on effects that, we talk about. They're ramping up their repression because they know the worse the climate crisis gets, the more people are going to protest against, the lack of action. So if they can keep ramping up their repression, they're combating the rising movement. But I don't think it's going to be successful because I think, people see that these attempts to crack down on our rights to protest and things like that, and that actually drives more people to come to the rallies and more people to come to events like the Blockade.
Yeah, absolutely. People don't like being told what to do, and they don't like being told they can't do something. So when the government says you can't do this, especially when it's so unreasonable and so ridiculous, and they're trying to stop a genuine democratic, positive movement, and people can see that, they go, well, fuck you, government. I'm going to do it.
Yeah, 100%. I think we should talk about next week on the podcast. There's been these arrests of protesters from Disrupt Land Forces, which are obviously the big protest that we covered a little while ago, where there was this really intense police response, including like rubber bullets and tear gas and horses and things like that. And now
there's been a lot of press.
they're going after people who were involved in organising in any kind of capacity. So hopefully we'll get a good interview with someone who's being targeted by that next week, if possible. Just to kind of wrap up this story, because it's still ongoing. The Supreme Court case they're going back on the 5th of November, so we won't know the result kind of until then. If you're listening to this after that, you can probably go up and check. But as we're recording, we don't know what's going to happen. But Rising Tide has said that regardless of the outcome of the case, which hopefully they'll win their case and that everything will be allowed to go ahead, they've said they're going to continue to prepare for the blockade because it will still remain completely legal to assemble on a public beach and a public park and to kayak on the harbour. So there's it's still going to go ahead. Obviously, there's different factors that might come into play depending on the result of the case, but no one should be cancelling their tickets to Newcastle or however you're getting there. It's because it's still going to go ahead. And Zach Schofield, who I mentioned is the spokesperson who we interviewed on the podcast a few weeks ago, he said that now more than ever, we need to exercise our democratic right to protest. And so we hope to see thousands of people join us. And I think that was something that I took away from the interview with Zach a few weeks ago was the police can, escalate and ramp up as much as they like. But if there's, 3,000 people on a beach all wanting to do something, there's not really much they can do to stop them. So I think this is all going to go ahead and it should all be good. What we're going to do is we've got a few short clips from the action outside the Supreme Court on the 1st of November. So we'll play some of those clips.
So it's not the public that benefits when the right to protest is curtailed, repressed, restricted, or when peaceful protest organisers or movements are dragged towards court to defend Form 1 applications. It's not in the public's best interests.
Over the last year, the coal and gas industry has received over $14 billion in taxpayer money in direct subsidies to prop up their industries. And that is the state of affairs that Stephen Galilee and his friends in government want to carry on by banning everyday Australians standing up for our rights.
What do we want?
The right to protest!
When do we want it?
Now!
What do we want?
The right to protest!
When do we want it?
Now!
I say rising, you say time! Rising!
Time!
Rising!
Time!
Rising!
Time!
Rising!
Time!
So the Liberal National Party won the October 26 elections in Queensland with a clear majority. And while the LNP had been expected to win, they did not achieve the overwhelming victory that some had predicted, and Labor did a bit better than was expected. But to discuss this, we are joined by Alex Bainbridge, who is a Green Left journalist based in Magangin, Brisbane, and he's going to talk about what these results mean for activists. So welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Thanks, Isaac. Pleasure to be here.
So, as I just mentioned, the LNP won overall. They got about a 7% swing against Labor. Meanwhile, the Greens kind of seem to stall. They've got a similar amount of votes as the 2020 elections. What's your kind of overall assessment of the result?
Well, obviously, it's not good that the LNP won, but from my point of view, looking at it from a progressive point of view, the result of the Greens is what is most important, because that's what's going to shape the future of progressive politics more than the results for Labor or the LNP. And I mean, some people might find that a bit controversial to say that, but I'm quite happy to defend that statement in terms of Labor and Liberal are both neoliberal parties. Sure, the LNP is worse and faster, but both Labor and the LNP share the same overall agenda. And at least in the parliamentary arena, which is only one arena, but in the parliamentary arena, the Greens are the most prominent opposition to that neoliberal agenda. So I think the Greens result is the most important of all. And if you judge by the media coverage, like the establishment media coverage, That's been a message of, oh, the Greens did disastrously. Oh, they've lost their seats. Oh, all their target seats, they had swings against them. Oh, this is all because of Max Chandler Mather being too radical. The Greens are too radical. Oh, this has really definitely got bad news for the federal Greens. I mean, this is the kind of message which is being presented by the establishment media. And if you're just paying a superficial attention to politics, that's going to be the message you're going to receive. And basically, that's a false message. And it's false for a number of reasons. We should be clear the Greens didn't do as well as they had hoped, and they didn't do as well as they expected. That is, of course, disappointing for all progressive people, or at least in my view. But statewide, the Greens actually held their own. They basically maintained their vote. In fact, it even went up. The swing's still being counted. It's sort of, it's jittering around a little bit, but it's like last I checked, it was up a fraction of a percentage. But essentially, the Greens held their own. And sure, they had swings against them in their two seats that they currently held, 7% in Maywa and 3% in South Brisbane, and they had swings against them in some of the target seats they were aiming to get. They also had swings in favour of them in some of the target seats they were trying to get, including actually they got swings in favour of the Greens in some of the state seats that are overlapping with Max Chandler Mather's federal seat. So that actually dampens the Greens are too radical, everyone hates Max Chandler Mather narrative. As I said, overall the Greens held their own. Now the media has presented, in fact, the ABC elections have got, the election website has got the Greens likely to lose their South Brisbane seat, but even that is actually a lot more nuanced than what the media is paying attention to. I mean, and the first thing that you should know about that is that's going to really depend on who comes third and whose preferences get distributed. So at the moment, the Greens are coming first, the Labor's coming second, and then not far behind Labor are the other Liberal LNP, the Liberal National Party in Queensland. But there's also 3% for One Nation. So if a large part of those One Nation preferences go to the LNP, and then if the LNP pick up postal votes, which they have been, or early votes, as they have been doing, then that creates the possibility, not definite, but the possibility that the Liberal LNP will come into second place, and then it won't be LNP preferences that are distributed, it'll be Labor preferences that are distributed. And if Labor preferences get distributed, there'll be enough Labor preferences go to the Greens that the Greens could well hold their seat. So even though the media coverage is talking about the Greens are half their seats, that may not be the case. Even if they do lose that South Brisbane seat, the shape of the vote hasn't changed. Yes, there was a marginal swing against them, but the main difference is that in the last election, the LNP, for their own distorted reasons, gave their preferences to the Greens, recommended preferences to the Greens. This time, the LNP, who looks like they've come third again, have recommended their preferences to Labor, so they're going to get Labor over the line if they remain in third place. So it's not actually the shape of the vote that has changed so much as the way the LNP directed their preferences. So when you take all those things together, the Greens have done pretty well, and especially on the progressive side of politics, and Labor tries to present themselves as if they're on the progressive side of politics, even though I think that's a view that we should contest. Labor suffered a 7% swing against them, and the Greens held their own. Overall, the Greens did better than the impression you're going to get from a superficial reading of the mainstream establishment media.
So you wrote in your article that the LNP ran with a kind of a small target election campaign focused on its so-called tough on crime talking points. Of course, this is something we've seen quite a bit around the country, most notably in the recent Northern Territory elections. For those who haven't been closely following the election, could you talk about this kind of right-wing push on so-called youth crime?
Well, I mean, the most important thing to say about the talk about youth crime is that it's a big beat up. All of the official police statistics say that youth crime is actually decreasing. Sorry, I'm just presuming I should keep on going even though Isaac's blanked out. Is that correct? Yeah, okay, all right, okay. Sorry, okay. I'll start again. All of the official Queensland police statistics say that youth crime is going down. And basically the LNP is is making a big beat up. They're talking about youth crime. The establishment media is helping them create the narrative that youth crime is a problem when in fact it isn't. And people are picking up on the narrative. And of course, it's not hard for people. Most people can say an anecdote of some time in their life where they or their friends, got robbed or something. But that's not the same thing as an overall trend going up or down. And I mean, not this election, but last election, the LNP in Queensland had the exact same approach. They were talking about being tough on law and order and tough on crime, etc. And there was a leaflet by the LNP which was dropped into my letterbox, which basically said, crime is out of control. Basically, robberies have gone up by this much, and like something else has gone up by this much. And I went and looked and had a very thorough analysis of the police statistics, and basically, that was like they cherry picked data. Basically, they cherry picked these two particular categories out of numerous categories of crime that were on the Queensland website, and even robbery sounds like like there's different type robbery, burglary, armed robbery. There's different types. There's multiple. Robbery doesn't include all the things you might think of as robbery, and basically in like 1 3-month period or 6-month period, I forget which, there was this relatively dramatic percentage increase in that time. But it was just part of an up and down trend over time, and certainly when you average it out across all crime, it was virtually unchanged over a long period of time. Like it was more or less a flat line in terms of the overall crime rate in Queensland. So that was blatant lies that the LNP were putting to try and create a narrative, a false narrative, to lie to the people, to basically create an impression that we needed tough on crime solutions. Now, so now, as I said, this time the youth crime in particular was a complete beat up because the figures are absolutely going down for youth crime in Queensland. But there's a few things that should be mentioned. One thing that you never see the LNP talking about when they talk about crime is crimes like wage theft and industrial manslaughter. Basically, crimes that are carried out, or even things like the Commonwealth Bank being found guilty several years back of literally tens of thousands of counts of money laundering charges, or even just the other day, Harvey Norman got found guilty for misleading the public in its telling lies in its advertisements, and they got some phenomenal amount of sales from their lies, and a sort of a paltry slap on the wrist by the authorities. So I mean, it's that sort of corporate crime you never hear the LNP talking about. That's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I say is, to the extent that what people think of as crime, like your house being burgled or your car being stolen or something like that, the best way to address those kinds of crimes is not by harsher penalties and punishments. It's actually by doing things like raising the rate of job seeker to a living wage, basically ending poverty. Things like reducing the cost of living pressure. So like, solving the housing crisis, reducing rents, reducing mortgages. I mean, like those kinds of practical measures that make life more bearable for people, basically are the kinds of things that are needed to actually, in a meaningful way, reduce such crime as exists. And the LNP policy platform goes exactly in the opposite direction of actually solving the real problem. So what I'd say about the crime push is, one, it's a lie, based on a lie. Two, their solutions don't match the problem. And then thirdly, the other thing I didn't say is what they are putting forward, this totally barbaric adult time for adult crime, that is going to cause more social problems, and actually, in fact, it'll cause more crime, because the more you imprison young people, the more they're going to be hanging out with criminals and learning about how to commit crime more effectively, and also the less they'll be engaged and connected to their community. The more that people are connected to their communities, the less they're going to turn to crime.
Yeah, thanks for that, Alex. Just to go to the other side, to what Labor did in the election campaign, a lot of people have pointed out that they took up some kind of more progressive policies. Some people saying they're stealing from the Greens policies, things like free primary school lunches and 50-cent public transport, things like that. What do you think this is coming from? What's your take on this progressive slide?
Look, I think that, it's definitely true that Labor put a progressive tack. And, the Premier before the election, Stephen Miles, he only came into the Premier's job less than a year ago. So before that was Anna Palaszczuk. She was basically on the right wing of the Labor Party, even though, to be fair, that Labor government under Anastasia Palaszczuk did actually bring in a number of reforms, not just the abortion rights, but on several social issues of that kind, including like decriminalisation of sex work, and there are a number of them. And there were community campaigns in relation to many of those, but also not necessarily the community campaigns that Labor couldn't have ignored if they'd wanted to. So the Labor government, despite their overall policy platform being very business friendly, had some merits. But certainly since Stephen Miles became Premier less than a year ago, and also he became Premier because Labor was doing very disastrously in the polls. So he was basically, trying to bring in a policy platform that could actually try and arrest that decline and save Labor as many seats as possible. And, the LNP's only actually held one. This is the second time the LNP has won government in Queensland, I believe, since 1989. So it's definitely that sort of more than 30-year period. So it's been Labor at a state level running Queensland for quite a long time. But they brought in this sort of progressive tack. Now, one of the things the Greens point out is that while they adopted a lot of the Greens' messaging and policies that seem superficially similar to the Greens policies actually are a lot more far-reaching, and for that matter, socialist alliance policies as well. But like, for example, where the Greens have a policy of free public transport altogether, the Labor policy is 50-cent fares. Where the Greens have a policy of free school meals, i.e. breakfast and lunch, for both primary and secondary students, the Labor policy was free lunches only for primary school students. So things like that. The Greens policy was more far-reaching than Labor's. So it's not true to say that Labor stole Greens policies. They basically they stole policies that, to a superficial observer, would seem like they're more progressive, and they were more progressive. Frankly, we would be better off if Labor's minimalist, wholly inadequate, but still better than nothing agenda was implemented instead of what we're likely to expect from the LNP. And I should say it's not yet clear what we're going to get, what we're going to see from the LNP, because aside from their youth crime push, their promises were very vague and non-specific in the lead up to the election. So it remains to be seen how they're going to govern. So on the Labor pitch, I think what that shows, the Greens have pointed out, I think correctly, that a progressive platform is actually popular with voters, and it wasn't enough to turn the tide in this particular election, but it certainly probably saved Labor more seats than they would have had otherwise. But I think the most important thing to say about it is, it shows that Labor has got the capacity to be tactically adept and to actually, Labor is not only capable of the sort of the right wing policies that we're seeing at federal level. They can make a sort of at least the impression of a left wing turn. By the same token, they're never going to do that unless they're under pressure. And if you genuinely want progressive change, it's not going to be enough to vote Labor. Progressive people wanting to work within Labor or basically push it to the left, etc., will have a much better chance of pushing Labor to the left by building the left outside the Labor Party. To some extent, that's the Greens, but also in an important way, that's also the more activist, the more hardcore left, like the socialist left, and in particular, obviously, Socialist Alliance, which I'm part of. Like, I think if you actually really want to see progressive change, that's actually where that's where we're going to see more bang for your buck in terms of actually your efforts paying off and actually bring progressive change.
So that segues pretty nicely into the last question I've got, which is what would be the next steps for grassroots activists? So I guess people who are already kind of thinking the way you're describing, people who, understand that, you make change by forming left on the outside, on the streets, on the grassroots level. What are the next steps for them in Queensland dealing with the LNP government?
Well, look, tonight, as we're recording this, so it's a Friday, and we've got a rally a rally to preserve abortion rights tonight. So obviously, we do need to organise campaigns against any particular specific attacks that come down from the LNP government, including at the industrial level and in the social movement level, and also beyond that, we need to build a political alternative to both Labor and the LNP. And as I said, I think to their credit, the Greens actually are partway doing that, and the socialist left also is partway doing that, and really neither of us have got the rounded and sizable enough political alternatives that we need. And in fact, my view has long been that if we take all the strengths of the Greens and the strengths of the socialist left, that's what we need from a political alternative to Labor and the LNP. And so in whatever way makes the most sense to you, I would advocate to people to actually to get involved and build that political alternative. And as I said, I think there's actually, even though the Social Alliance is a very small group in Queensland, it's actually a really good way to be involved. And we are part of the campaigns that are necessary to force progressive change, and also we're part of building that political alternative, including actually arguing not just for this or that policy improvement, but actually for a fundamental change in the system as a whole, so we don't have to deal with these lies from establishment media and establishment politicians every single election cycle, and so we don't have to campaign for basic rights over and over again.
Awesome. Thanks so much for joining us this week, Alex. People can read Alex's article on greenleft.org.au if you want to have a think about, what these results mean. But yeah, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Isaac, and a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for listening to the latest episode of the Green Left News Podcast. If you'd liked this podcast and you want to hear more of it, please consider becoming a supporter. greenleft.org.au/support for $5 a month. Makes a massive difference to help us continue. And we're actually starting a supporter drive at the start of November going towards Rising Tide. We're trying to make sure we can get as many of our activist journalists to the blockade as possible so that we can, cover it. We did quite a lot of coverage last year, but we want to step it up even more as this is an even bigger event. So we're really asking for people to become a supporter if you haven't already. If you're already a supporter, please, talk to your friends, talk to your family who might be interested in finding out a bit more about, left-wing politics or activism and things like that, and ask them to sign up. It's only a few bucks a month, so it's quite affordable. If you're someone who has a bit more money to spare, you can also make a donation as well. It's greenleft.org.au/donate, and that makes a huge difference. As we say often on the podcast, we don't take any corporate advertising or sponsorships. We're all entirely people-powered and pretty much get by on our, supporterships and generous kind of donations and fundraising. So yeah, check out greenleft.org.au/support to find out, see the different plans and sign up. Also, obviously, the Rising Tide People's Blockade is coming up from the 19th to the 28th of November. It's going to be a really great protest, as we talked about earlier on the podcast. They're hoping for 10,000 people over the 10 days. But yeah, if you can't make it to the whole thing, which is, 10 days is quite big, make sure you get to the weekend from the 22nd to the 24th. That's when the actual blockade out on the water is going to happen. There'll be thousands of people in kayaks and other little boats, and heaps of great musicians and acts going on the beach during the day. It's a really great kind of family-friendly, fun atmosphere. It's been called a protestival before because it's got this kind of festival atmosphere with people camping and things. So definitely come along and keep up to date with our coverage on Green Left. And also there's still weekly Palestine rallies happening in Sydney and Melbourne, and so many other little actions happening all over the place for the Palestine movement. So check out greenleft.org.au/events, and that's got all the nearest events. You can filter by city or filter by, find out what's close to you. And just a final thank you to Sean Valenzuela or at Little Archer Beats for the music that you've heard on this podcast. And that's about all we've got time for. So thanks for listening.
Bye.